The gavel echoed like a gunshot through the mahogany-panelled walls of the Superior Court. Richard Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table, a smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted his custom Tom Ford tie. He was a Silicon Valley titan worth $500 million, and today he was about to legally discard his quiet, unassuming wife Amelia with a meager severance package. He had the best lawyer's money could buy, a bulletproof narrative of self-made brilliance and unwavering confidence. But Richard had made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot who handed him the keys to his kingdom. And in exactly 10 minutes, Amelia's attorney was going to completely dismantle his life. The air inside courtroom 302 of the San Francisco Superior Court was thick with the suffocating tension that only a high-stakes divorce could generate. Judge Thomas Mercer, a man whose deeply lined face suggested decades of witnessing the absolute worst of human nature, peered over his wire-rimmed glasses at the two opposing tables. At the plaintiff's table sat Richard Sterling. At 39, Richard was the picture of modern tech-bro aristocracy. He wore a tailored navy suit that cost more than most people's vehicles, his hair styled to achieve that perfectly effortless look that actually required an hour and an expensive barber. To his right was Gregory Hughes, a high-powered, aggressive litigator known throughout the Bay Area for leaving opposing counsels in tears. Gregory's hourly rate was astronomical, a fee Richard was more than happy to pay to ensure he kept his empire intact. Across the aisle sat Amelia Sterling. The contrast was almost comical, heavily engineered by Richard's legal team to paint a specific picture for the judge. Amelia wore a simple, modest beige cardigan over a plain floral blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a practical, unpretentious clip. She looked exactly as Richard had described her in his explosive 60-page legal filing. A simple, traditional housewife. A woman who preferred tending to her rose garden and baking sourdough bread while her husband conquered the unforgiving landscape of the tech industry. Next to her sat Josephine Caldwell, a sharp-featured woman in her late 50s with a reputation for meticulous, almost surgical cross-examinations. "Mr. Hughes," Judge Mercer grumbled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "You may call your first witness." "Thank you, Your Honor. We call Richard Sterling to the stand," Gregory announced, his voice booming with theatrical confidence. Richard stood, buttoned his suit jacket with a practiced flick of his wrists, and strode confidently to the witness stand. He placed his left hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and took his seat, leaning forward ever so slightly to project an aura of earnest transparency. Mr. Sterling," Gregory began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box, though there was no jury present, only the judge and the gallery. "Let's discuss the primary asset in this dissolution of marriage. Sterling Innovations, a company currently valued at approximately $450 million. "Yes, that's correct," Richard said, his voice smooth and steady. "Can you describe for the court your wife's role in the founding and daily operations of Sterling Innovations?" Richard offered a small, almost pitying smile. He looked briefly at Amelia, who was quietly taking notes on a yellow legal pad, not even meeting his gaze. Amelia is a wonderful person, but she has absolutely no head for business. When I founded the company in our garage 7 years ago, her primary contribution was ensuring I had dinner and a quiet house to work in. She never looked at a spreadsheet, never attended a board meeting, and certainly never contributed any capital or strategic direction. So, it would be accurate to say that Sterling Innovations is the sole product of your intellect, your labor, and your business acumen?" Gregory asked, teeing up the soft pitch. "Entirely," Richard replied without a moment's hesitation. "I worked 100-hour weeks. I pitched to venture capitalists. I negotiated the contracts. Amelia, bless her heart, didn't even understand what the software did. She just liked that it eventually paid for a nice house in Palo Alto." Gregory turned to the judge. "Your Honor, as outlined in our briefs, we are offering Mrs. Sterling a very generous settlement. $5 million, the house in Carmel, and spousal support for 5 years. This represents an incredible windfall for a woman who contributed zero capital and zero intellectual property to the marital estate's primary asset. To divide Sterling Innovations in half would be to award Mrs. Sterling a windfall of over $200 million for simply being married to a genius. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard sat back, radiating a smug satisfaction. He had built the narrative perfectly. He was the golden goose. Amelia was just the barnyard fixture. He expected her to cry. He expected her to break down and accept the $5 million, taking her knitting needles and gardening shears out of his life forever, so he could marry his 26-year-old director of marketing. Amelia, however, didn't try. She didn't even flinch. She simply finished writing a line on her yellow legal pad, underlined it twice, and slid it across the table to her lawyer. Josephine Caldwell read the note, a slow, predatory smile creeping onto her lips. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her severe black skirt suit. "Are you finished, Mr. Hughes?" Josephine asked, her voice quiet, but possessing an icy edge that immediately lowered the temperature in the room. "The plaintiff passes the witness," Gregory said, sitting down with a satisfied sigh. "Ms. Assing Blice, Mr. Caldwell, your witness," Judge Mercer prompted. Josephine walked slowly toward the podium, carrying a thick manila folder. She didn't look at Richard immediately. Instead, she opened the folder, meticulously arranging a series of documents on the slanted wooden surface. The silence in the courtroom stretched, pulling tight like a piano wire. "Mr. Sterling," Josephine finally began, looking up. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating him the way a butcher evaluates a side of beef. "You just testified that you built Sterling Innovations entirely on your own. Your intellect, your labor, your capital." "That is correct," Richard answered, his tone dripping with condescension. "I built it from the ground up." "From the ground up," Josephine repeated, tasting her words. "Let's talk about the ground, shall we? Let's go back to 2019. The garage days, as you so romantically put it. Sterling Innovations was not doing well, was it?" Richard stiffened slightly. "It was a startup." "Startups have growing pains." "Growing pains," Josephine echoed. She pulled a piece of paper from her stack. "According to these bank records, which we subpoenaed, in October of 2019, Sterling Innovations had exactly $412 in its corporate account. You had maxed out 4 personal credit cards. You were 2 weeks away from missing payroll for your 3 engineers. Does that sound like a growing pain, or does that sound like impending bankruptcy?" "Objection, Your Honor," Gregory barked, standing up. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Not power mouth forward 3 but "Overruled," Judge Mercer said, leaning heavily on his elbows. "I'm curious to hear how the genius solved this problem. Answer the question, Mr. Sterling." Richard swallowed, adjusting his collar. "We were in a tight spot. Cash flow issues. But I secured funding." "Ah, yes." "The funding," Josephine said, her eyes flashing. "The legendary Series A round that saved your company. You secured an emergency injection of $3 million. Without that money, Sterling Innovations would have died in that garage, correct?" "It was a pivotal investment, yes," Richard admitted reluctantly. "And who provided that investment?" "Mr. Pastor." "Sterling." "A private equity firm." "Aegis Holdings," Richard said, regaining some of his swagger. "They saw the potential in my code. They believed in my vision." "Aegis Holdings," Josephine said, walking out from behind the podium and approaching the witness stand. "A private limited liability corporation registered in Delaware. Did you ever meet the principals of Aegis Holdings, Mr. Hart?" "Sterling?" Richard frowned. "No. They operate through proxy representatives. It's not uncommon in high-level venture capital. They prefer to remain anonymous to avoid being inundated with pitches. I dealt entirely with their corporate legal team." "So," An anonymous firm drops $3 million into your dying company, and you just took the check. I earned that check, Richard snapped, his temper flaring. I sent them my business plan, my proprietary algorithm. They saw a winner. They certainly saw something, Josephine mused. In exchange for that $3 million, what did Aegis Holdings require? Standard equity, Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. We negotiated a stake. A stake, Josephine said, her voice rising in volume. Let's be specific for the court, Mr. Sterling. Aegis Holdings didn't just ask for a stake. They demanded preferred stock. In fact, due to your desperate financial situation, they leveraged you into a corner. Isn't it true that Aegis Holdings currently owns 51% of the voting shares of Sterling Innovations? Gregory jumped up. Objection. Relevance. What does the corporate ownership structure have to do with Mrs. Sterling's lack of contribution to the marital estate? I assure you, Your Honor, the relevance will become blindingly clear in about 60 seconds, Josephine replied calmly. I'll allow it, but get to the point, Miss Caldwell, Judge Mercer warned. Isn't it true, Mr. Sterling? Thou, Josephine pressed. You may be the CEO, but you are a minority shareholder in your own company. Aegis Holdings owns 51%. You own 49%. You were an employee of Aegis. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. They are a silent partner. I run the company. They have never interfered in a single operational decision in 7 years. Oh, I know they haven't interfered, Josephine smiled, a terrifying, genuine smile. They let you do all the heavy lifting. Why interrupt a man who is working 100-hour weeks to make them rich? Now to Mark. She walked back to her table and picked up a different, thicker document, bound in blue legal backing. Mr. Sterling, you testified earlier that your wife, Amelia, is a simple woman, that she has no head for business, that she just baked bread and tended to her roses while you conquered the world. That is my testimony, Richard spat. Are you aware of your wife's family history, Mr. Sterling? Richard looked confused. Her family, they're quiet people from the Midwest. Her father passed away before we met. She inherited a little bit of money, a few $100,000, which she kept in a separate account. She used it to buy knitting supplies and organic flour. He let out a dry, mocking laugh. Josephine didn't laugh. She held up the blue-bound document. Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence Defense Exhibit D. It is the complete, unredacted articles of incorporation and beneficiary registry for Aegis Holdings, LLC, obtained via federal subpoena. Gregory frowned, leaning over his table, suddenly looking uneasy. Richard stared at the blue folder, a cold, unexplainable dread beginning to pool in his stomach. What is this? Richard asked, his voice losing its booming confidence. Mr. Sterling, Josephine said, her voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate volume. Amelia's father didn't leave her a few $100,000. Her father was Jonathan Sterling. No, wait. Her father was Jonathan Montgomery. Josephine corrected herself seamlessly, maintaining the intense eye contact. The late founder of Montgomery Logistics. He left her a trust fund worth approximately $40 million. Richard stared at her, his mouth slightly open. That's impossible. She drives a 10-year-old Subaru. She likes the Subaru, Josephine shrugged. But more importantly, she liked you. She believed in you. When you were crying in your garage in 2019, staring down bankruptcy, she wanted to help you. But she knew your ego, Mr. Sterling. She knew you would never accept money from your simple wife. You needed to feel like a titan. Josephine walked right up to the wooden rail of the witness box. Mr. Sterling, please read the name of the sole 100% owner and managing director of Aegis Holdings, LLC, as listed on page 4 of that document. My apostolic Talk. See. Richard's hands were trembling as the bailiff handed him the document. He flipped to page 4. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, dropping down to the bolded lines at the bottom of the page. The silence in the room was absolute. Only the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Richard's face drained of all color. The tan he had acquired on his recent yacht trip in Cabo seemed to vanish, replaced by the sickly pallor of a corpse. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Read it, Mr. Sterling," Josephine commanded, her voice ringing out like a judge pronouncing a sentence. "Read it for the court." Richard looked up, his eyes wide, terrified, and fixed on his wife. Amelia was no longer taking notes. She was looking right back at him. The modest, simple housewife in the beige cardigan offered him a small, polite smile. It was the exact same smile she gave the postman. "Amelia," Richard choked out, his voice cracking. "Amelia Montgomery Sterling." Josephine turned to Judge Mercer, who was now leaning over his bench, thoroughly captivated. "Your Honor," Josephine announced loudly, "Mr. Magia Sterling is correct that he is not required to split his 49% of the company with my client. She doesn't want it, because my client, through her private holding company, already owns 51% of Sterling Innovations. She is his boss. She is the majority shareholder. And as of this morning, Aegis Holdings has scheduled an emergency board meeting for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Josephine turned back to Richard, who looked like he was about to faint. "And the only item on the agenda, Mr. Sterling, is the immediate termination of the CEO." The silence in courtroom 302 was so profound it felt heavy, pressing down on Richard Sterling's chest until he could barely draw a breath. He stared at the blue-bound document in his trembling hands as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The bold, undeniable print staring back at him, Amelia Montgomery Sterling, Soleil Managing Director, was a catastrophic reality check. "Objection." Gregory Hughes suddenly bellowed, his voice cracking slightly, betraying a rare moment of sheer panic. He slapped his hands flat against his table, practically lunging toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor, this is an egregious ambush. Defense counsel has fabricated a ridiculous narrative and submitted corporate documents without proper foundation. We have had absolutely no time to review this. This fiction." Judge Mercer, who had been resting his chin on his steepled fingers, leveled a glacial glare at the high-priced attorney. "Mr. Hughes, unless my eyes are failing me, that document bears the official seal of the Delaware Division of Corporations, alongside a sworn affidavit from a federal financial auditor. Are you accusing Miss Caldwell of forging federal documents in my courtroom?" Gregory swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. "No, Your Honor, but these documents are buried in thousands of pages of discovery. The defense willfully obscured their true intent." "Mr. Ma." "Hughes," Josephine Caldwell interrupted, her voice as smooth as polished glass. "We provided the entire financial portfolio of my client as required by law. It is not my fault, nor my client's fault, that you and Mr. Sterling were so blinded by your own arrogance, so utterly convinced that Mrs. Sterling was nothing more than a simple housewife, that you failed to actually read the financial disclosures. You assumed her separate accounts held nothing but grocery money. Your willful ignorance is not grounds for an objection." Judge Mercer nodded slowly, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I tend to agree, Miss Caldwell. The documents are admitted into evidence. Mr. Sterling, you are still under oath. Have you read the document?" Richard looked up, his perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled. The smug, untouchable aura of the Silicon Valley titan had evaporated entirely, replaced by the cornered look of a man watching his empire burn to the ground. "Ah, I've read it," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. So it appears your silent partner isn't quite so silent anymore, Judge Mercer observed dryly. And it appears she will be restructuring her company tomorrow morning. Do you have any further questions for your client on direct examination, Mr. Hughes? Perhaps about his 100-hour work weeks on behalf of his wife? Your Honor, I request an immediate recess, Gregory pleaded, furiously wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. We need time to confer and review these articles of incorporation. This changes the entire landscape of the dissolution. I imagine it does, Judge Mercer said, checking his watch. I will grant a 30-minute recess. But be warned, Mr. Hughes. When we return, I expect actual legal arguments, not theatrics. He slammed his gavel down. Court is in recess. As the judge retreated to his chambers, the courtroom erupted into a chaotic buzz. Gregory grabbed Richard by the bicep, his fingernails digging into the expensive wool of his client's suit, and dragged him out the side doors into the marble corridor. What the hell is going on, Richard? Gregory hissed, pinning the billionaire against the wall of the private consultation room. You told me she had no money. You told me her father was a nobody. Jonathan Montgomery founded one of the largest logistics empires in the Midwest. He sold it to FedEx for hundreds of millions. I didn't know, Richard shouted back, his voice echoing off the tile. She never talked about him. She drove a 10-year-old car. She bought her clothes at Target. How was I supposed to know she was sitting on a $40 million trust fund? Because she's your wife, Gregory barked, slamming his briefcase onto the conference table. And now she owns 51% of your company. Do you understand what that means, Richard? She has voting control. She has the board. She can fire you. She can liquidate the assets. She can force a hostile buyout of your shares at a discount. You just spent 60 pages of legal filings calling the majority shareholder of your company a useless, simple-minded burden. Richard felt physically sick. The walls of the small room felt like they were closing in. For 7 years he had treated Amelia like a quaint domestic accessory. He had paraded his wealth, flaunted his power, and belittled her at every turn, completely unaware that she was the phantom architect of his entire reality. She had literally bought his success, letting him play the genius while she held the leash. I need to talk to her, Richard said, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I can fix this. She loves me. She's just hurt because of the divorce. If I talk to her alone, I can get her to back down. Not tall for my youth. Before Gregory could stop him, Richard shoved open the door and marched back into the empty courtroom. Amelia was still sitting at the defense table, quietly sipping from a paper cup of water, her beige cardigan draped over her shoulders. Josephine was nowhere to be seen. Amelia, Richard said, his tone shifting instantly from panic to a practiced, manipulative softness. He approached the wooden railing, leaning over it. Amelia, sweetheart, look at me. Amelia slowly lowered her cup. She looked at him, her expression infuriatingly placid. Why didn't you tell me? He pleaded, trying to summon a look of wounded betrayal. Why did you lie to me for 7 years? We're a team. We're partners. Partners? Amelia repeated, the word rolling off her tongue like a foreign concept. He made it very clear today, Richard, that we are not partners. You built everything. I contributed nothing. I just baked bread. That was just lawyers talking. Richard insisted, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. It's a game, Amy. You know how ruthless these tech divorces get. I was just trying to protect the company. Our company. But this? Firing me? You're going to destroy Sterling Innovations just to punish me? You'll lose your investment. Amelia tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were a particularly fascinating specimen under a microscope. I'm not going to destroy the company, Richard. The underlying technology is quite brilliant. You're a wonderful engineer, but you're a terrible CEO. You're reckless, you're arrogant, and you've alienated half our board. I am simply fulfilling my fiduciary duty to Aegis Holdings by replacing a toxic liability. Richard's face flushed. You can't run that company. You don't know the first thing about software development. I don't have to. Amelia smiled gently. I hired the former COO of Oracle to take over your desk on Monday. He's very excited about the transition. Richard stared at her, completely paralyzed. The woman sitting before him wasn't the docile housewife he'd ignored for years. She was a corporate predator who had waited patiently in the tall grass, letting him grow fat and arrogant before striking. All rise, the bailiff called out as Judge Mercer swept back into the courtroom, his black robes billowing. The tense energy in the room had shifted entirely. Gregory Hughes looked pale and exhausted, having spent the entire 30-minute recess frantically reading the Aegis Holdings bylaws. Josephine Caldwell, conversely, looked incredibly relaxed, arranging her files with the serene grace of a grandmaster who had already seen checkmate 12 moves ahead. "All right, Mr. Hughes," Judge Mercer grumbled, taking his seat. "Have you recovered from your shock? How does the plaintiff wish to proceed?" Gregory stood up, buttoning his jacket in a desperate attempt to project authority. He had formulated a new strategy. It was a retreat, but a strategic one. "Your Honor," Gregory began, his voice surprisingly steady, "we acknowledge the unconventional nature of the defense's corporate ownership reveal. However, while Mrs. Sterling may own 51% of the company through her holding firm, my client still owns 49%. It is his intellectual property that powers the software. Furthermore, we must draw the court's attention to the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties in 2017. Richard sat a little straighter. The prenup. It was his brainchild. He had insisted on it before their wedding, terrified that this simple woman might one day try to claim half of the massive fortune he was convinced he was destined to make. "The prenuptial agreement is ironclad," Gregory continued, walking toward the judge. "Section 4 explicitly states that any assets, trusts, or wealth acquired prior to the marriage remain the sole property of that individual. This protects Mrs. Sterling's inherited wealth. However, Section 6 clearly outlines that any business assets created during the marriage, namely, Richard's 49% of Sterling Innovations, remain his sole and separate property. Mrs. Sterling cannot touch his shares, nor can she force a buyout without his explicit consent at a valuation of his choosing." Gregory turned to look at Josephine, a triumphant gleam returning to his eye. "So while she may be the majority shareholder, she is locked into a partnership with my client. He retains his equity, which is currently valued at roughly $220 million. The plaintiff respectfully requests that the court enforce the prenuptial agreement, finalize the divorce, and leave the corporate structure as a separate civil matter." Richard exhaled a shaky breath. $220 million. He was losing his CEO title and he was losing his pride, but he was still walking away a multi-millionaire. He could start a new company. He could still win. Judge Mercer looked over at the defense table. "Ms. Caldwell, do you contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement?" Josephine stood up slowly. "Not at all, Your Honor. We stipulate that the prenuptial agreement is entirely valid, legally binding, and fiercely drafted by Mr. Ramarile, Sterling's own attorneys." Gregory frowned. It was too easy. Why wasn't she fighting it? "In fact," Josephine continued, pulling a thick binder from her bag, "we are relying heavily on that exact document, specifically Section 8, subsection C, the morals and fiduciary clause." Richard's stomach dropped. He didn't remember a morals clause. "As Mr. Hughes pointed out," Josephine said, pacing in front of the table, "Mr. Sterling insisted on a very aggressive prenup. He wanted to ensure that if the marriage dissolved, his assets were protected. But my client's lawyers added a standard addendum. Section 8 states that if either party commits a breach of marital fidelity or commits financial fraud against the other party, the at-fault individual forfeits their protections under Section 6. meaning their business assets become subject to immediate liquidation and transfer. Nots. Objection, Gregory shouted. Your Honor, this is California. This is a no-fault divorce state. Infidelity does not dictate the division of community or separate property. It does when you sign a valid private contract stipulating otherwise, Mr. Hughes, Judge Mercer countered sharply. You brought up the prenup, Counselor. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. Overruled. Proceed, Mrs. Caldwell. Thank you, Your Honor. Josephine smiled. Mr. Sterling, let's talk about Madison Hayes. Your 26-year-old director of marketing. Richard froze. He had been careful. He had used burner phones, cash when possible, and always booked hotels under assumed names. I don't know what you're implying. She is a valued employee. She is certainly highly valued, Josephine agreed. She opened the binder and extracted a stack of glossy photographs, handing them to the bailiff to pass to the judge, and then to Gregory. Defense Exhibits E through H. Photographs taken over the last 8 months by a licensed private investigator. They show Mr. Sterling and Miss Sterling and Miss Hayes checking into the Four Seasons in Maui, the Ritz-Carlton in Paris, and a private villa in Cabo San Lucas. Gregory looked at the photos, his face falling. It was undeniable. Richard kissing Madison, Richard holding her hand on a yacht, Richard carrying her bags into a luxury suite. As you said, Mr. Hughes, California is a no-fault state. Josephine addressed the room, her voice echoing off the wood panels. If Mr. Sterling had simply had a discreet affair, it would be morally reprehensible, but perhaps legally irrelevant to the standard asset division. However, Mr. Sterling made a catastrophic error. Josephine pulled another document from her binder. It was a dense spreadsheet covered in red highlights. Mr. Sterling, how did you pay for the presidential suite in Paris? How did you charter the private jet to Cabo? How did you purchase the $40,000 Cartier diamond tennis bracelet you gifted Ms. Hayes last December? Richard was silent. He looked at Gregory, pleading for an objection, but Gregory was staring at the spreadsheet in sheer horror. Let the record show, Josephine thundered, her voice filled with righteous authority, that Richard Sterling paid for his lavish international affair using the Sterling Innovations corporate executive account. He used corporate funds that belong to a company in which he is a minority shareholder. The courtroom went dead silent. The gravity of what she was saying settled over the room like a thick fog. Your Honor, Josephine continued, turning to the bench. By using company funds to finance his extramarital affair, Richard Sterling didn't just cheat on his wife. He embezzled from his majority shareholder. He committed a gross breach of fiduciary duty and corporate fraud. Under Section 8 of the prenuptial agreement, this invalidates his protection of his 49% stake. Josephine walked back to her table and stood beside Amelia, resting a hand gently on her client's shoulder. Furthermore, under the bylaws of Aegis Holdings, which governs Sterling Innovations, any executive found guilty of embezzling corporate funds can have their equity immediately seized by the majority shareholder as restitution, valued at a 50% penalty. She looked directly at Richard, her eyes merciless. My client doesn't just want to divorce Mr. Sterling. She's invoking her right as the injured party and majority shareholder. We are seizing your 49% stake to cover the damages of your embezzlement. You aren't leaving this marriage with $200 million. You are leaving with the clothes on your back, or you will be facing federal fraud charges. The choice is yours. The threat of federal fraud charges hung in the air of courtroom 302 like a guillotine waiting to drop. Richard Sterling, a man who had built his entire identity on the premise of being the smartest person in any room, suddenly looked like a frightened child. His perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit now seemed like a hollow costume. Gregory Hughes, however, was not paid $1,500 an hour to simply surrender. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals fought viciously. He slammed his hand on the table, desperately trying to reclaim the narrative. "Your Honor, this is an outrageous overreach," Gregory shouted, his face flushed with indignation. Defense counsel is attempting to litigate a complex corporate malfeasance case in the middle of a family law proceeding. This court does not have the jurisdiction to unilaterally seize my client's equity based on a spreadsheet of contested credit card charges. It is not a contested spreadsheet, Mr. Hughes, Josephine Caldwell replied, her voice remaining at a calm conversational volume that somehow cut through his shouting. These are subpoenaed bank records from Sterling Innovations cross-referenced with Mr. Sterling's personal travel itineraries and the receipts for his paramour's luxury goods. And as for jurisdiction, we are not asking this court to adjudicate a corporate lawsuit. We are asking this court to enforce the prenuptial agreement that your client authored, signed, and demanded. The expenditures were business-related, Gregory countered, pointing a finger at the glossy photographs. Madison Hayes is the director of marketing. It is entirely customary for tech executives to travel with their marketing directors to global conferences, to entertain clients, and to build brand awareness. A luxury hotel in Paris is a write-off, not a crime. Judge Mercer leaned forward, his wire-rimmed glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. He picked up the photograph of Richard and Madison on the deck of a private yacht in Cabo San Lucas. Madison was wearing a microscopic bikini, and Richard was pouring champagne over her shoulder. "Tell me, Mr. But Hughes," Judge Mercer growled, his voice thick with sarcasm. "What exactly was the brand awareness strategy here? Were they marketing the champagne, the yacht, or the swimwear? Because unless Sterling Innovations is pivoting from enterprise software to high-end escort services, I failed to see the business application." A few stifled laughs echoed from the gallery. Richard buried his face in his hands. "Furthermore," Josephine added, stepping closer to the bench, Defense Exhibit G clearly shows the purchase of a $40,000 Cartier diamond tennis bracelet. The receipt, signed by Mr. Sterling, was billed to the company's miscellaneous vendor relations account. Did Miss Hayes require diamonds to properly execute her marketing duties, Mr. Kratz? Sterling. Richard snapped. The immense pressure, the public humiliation, and the terrifying realization of his impending bankruptcy shattered his practiced veneer. He stood up abruptly, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward with a loud clatter. "She made me do it!" Richard yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Richard, sit down," Gregory hissed, grabbing his client's arm, but Richard violently shook him off. "No, I want it on the record," Richard pleaded, looking wildly between the judge and Amelia. "Madison was extorting me. She knew about the company's upcoming product launch. She said if I didn't take her on these trips, if I didn't buy her things, she was going to file a sexual harassment lawsuit and ruin the IPO. I was protecting the company. I was protecting our assets, Amelia. I had to keep her quiet." The courtroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Even Gregory stepped away from his client, closing his eyes in absolute defeat. It was the cardinal sin of litigation, a client testifying to a new, uncorroborated, and highly illegal narrative without consulting their attorney. Amelia Sterling did not gasp. She did not look betrayed. She simply opened her beige leather handbag, retrieved a slim manila envelope, and handed it to Josephine. "Your Honor," Josephine said, almost sounding sympathetic to the catastrophic meltdown happening across the aisle. "Mr. Sterling's sudden allegation of extortion is certainly colorful. However, it is entirely contradicted by Defense Exhibit I." Josephine handed copies to the bailiff. "Last week, anticipating Mr. Peter Mesteran, Sterling's tendency to shift blame, my investigative team reached out to Miss Smart, Madison Hayes. When confronted with the reality that she was named as a co-conspirator in a corporate embezzlement scheme, Miss C. Hayes was remarkably cooperative. In exchange for a promise from the majority shareholder, my client not to pursue civil litigation against her, Miss. Hayes provided a sworn affidavit, along with a complete export of her text message history with Mr. Marp. Sterling. Richard's eyes rolled back in his head. He gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table to keep from collapsing. I will direct the court's attention to page 12 of the text logs, dated October 14th. Josephine read aloud, her voice ringing out crisp and clear. Mr. Sterling texts Miss Hayes, "Don't worry about the cost, babe. The company is paying for it. I'm going to drop the dead weight at home as soon as the new fiscal quarter starts, force the silent partners to buy me out, and we'll take the cash to Monaco." Josephine slowly lowered the paper, letting the words hang in the heavy air. She looked directly at Richard. There was no extortion, Mr. Sterling. There was only a deeply arrogant man who thought he could steal from his wife to finance his mistress, entirely unaware that his wife owned the vault. Judge Mercer slammed his hand flat onto the bench, his face a mask of judicial fury. "Mr. Hughes, control your client before I hold him in contempt. I have heard enough." "Mr. Hughes," Judge Mercer stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "your client's attempt to perjure himself in my courtroom by alleging extortion, only to be immediately contradicted by his own documented communications, is one of the most spectacularly foolish things I have witnessed from this bench." Gregory Hughes, a man who had won hundreds of high-profile divorces, simply nodded. He looked aged, deflated, and thoroughly beaten. "Understood, Your Honor." "Regarding the motion at hand," the judge continued, formally adjusting his robes, "I find the prenuptial agreement to be valid, binding, and clearly triggered by Mr. Sterling's documented financial fraud. He has utilized corporate funds mathematically belonging to Aegis Holdings for personal illicit expenses. Under Section 8, subsection C of the marital contract, Mr. Sterling forfeits the protection of his 49% equity." Richard let out a strangled, pathetic sound, like a drowning man taking his last gulp of air. "Furthermore," Judge Mercer added, signing a document with sharp, aggressive strokes of his pen, "I'm granting the defense's request for an immediate preliminary injunction. Mr. Sterling, as of this exact moment, you are legally barred from entering the premises of Sterling Innovations. You are barred from accessing its servers, its bank accounts, or contacting its employees regarding company business. The majority shareholder has the immediate right to seize your equity as restitution and restructure the executive board." Judge Mercer looked up, his eyes locking onto Richard's pale, sweat-drenched face. "You came in here demanding everything and offering your wife pennies, Mr. Sterling. You are leaving with exactly what you deserve. We will reconvene next Tuesday to finalize the standard dissolution of the marriage and the transfer of the Carmel property to Mrs. Sterling. We are adjourned." The gavel slammed down with finality. Chaos erupted in the gallery, but Richard couldn't hear it. The blood was rushing in his ears, a deafening roar of panic. He ignored Gregory, who was packing his briefcase with furious, silent speed. Richard pulled his phone from his pocket, his hand shaking so violently he dropped it on the floor. He scrambled to pick it up, his thumbs slipping over the glass screen as he frantically dialed. He needed to call David. David was his chief technology officer. They had built the original code together in the garage. David was his best friend. If Richard could just get David to lock down the servers to change the administrative passwords, he could hold the intellectual property hostage. He could force Amelia to negotiate. The phone rang twice. "Richard?" David's voice came through the speaker. He didn't sound frantic. He sounded nervous, formal. "Dave, listen to me," Richard hissed, turning his back to the courtroom. "You need to log into the mainframe right now. Change the master encryption keys. Revoke all access for the board. Amelia is trying to hostile take over the company. We have to lock her out." There was a long, excruciating pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, I can't do that," David said quietly. "What do you mean you can't? You're the CTO. Do it now or we lose everything." "I don't have access anymore, Richard. David confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "And neither do you." Richard froze. "What are you talking about?" "Amelia came to my house last night," David explained. "She had the Aegis Holdings documents. She showed me the receipts, Richard. The money you stole from the development fund to pay for Madison's jewelry. We needed that money for the server expansion." "Dave, please," "She offered me a choice," David interrupted, his tone hardening. "Go down with you as an accessory to corporate fraud, or help her transition the company. She doubled my salary, Richard. And she gave me 5% of your seized equity. I transferred the master keys to the new Oracle guy this morning. Your key card is dead. Your Slack account is deactivated. It's over, man. Don't call me again." The line went dead. Richard slowly lowered the phone. The bustling courtroom faded into a blur. He was a ghost. In the span of an hour, his wife had systematically dismantled his empire, locked him out of his own life's work, and bought the loyalty of his closest friend. He turned slowly. The courtroom was mostly empty now, save for the bailiff locking up the jury box. Out in the marble hallway, through the heavy glass doors, he saw her. Amelia Sterling was standing near the elevators. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't popping champagne. She was simply putting on her modest trench coat, speaking quietly with Josephine Caldwell. Richard pushed through the doors, his legs feeling like lead. "Amelia," he croaked, his voice devoid of any arrogance, replaced entirely by a hollow, broken desperation. Amelia paused, turning to look at him. Josephine immediately stepped forward, a protective shield, but Amelia gently touched her lawyer's arm, signaling her to stand down. "Yes, Richard," Amelia asked calmly. "You took everything," Richard whispered, tears finally welling in his eyes, not out of remorse, but out of pure self-pity. "My company, my money, my friends. You destroyed my life. You?" Amelia looked at him, her expression softening just a fraction, revealing a brief glimpse of the woman who had once loved him enough to secretly fund his dreams. "I didn't destroy your life, Richard," Amelia said softly. "I built your life. I gave you the soil, the water, and the sunlight to grow. All I asked for in return was respect. But you decided you grew entirely on your own, and you treated me like dirt." She pressed the elevator button. The metallic chime rang out in the quiet hallway. "I didn't take your company," she concluded, stepping into the waiting elevator car. "I just stopped pretending it was yours." The stainless steel doors slid shut, cutting off his view, leaving Richard Sterling completely and utterly alone. The following Tuesday, San Francisco was blanketed in a dense, suffocating fog that seemed to perfectly mirror the atmosphere inside courtroom 302. When Richard Sterling walked through the heavy mahogany doors, the transformation was jarring. The custom Tom Ford suit had been replaced by a wrinkled, off-the-rack gray blazer. His signature perfectly styled hair was flat and unwashed, and deep purple bags hung beneath his bloodshot eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. In truth, he hadn't. Gregory Hughes sat beside him, though the physical distance between the two men at the plaintiff's table was noticeably wider. Gregory was no longer the aggressive attack dog. He was a man simply running out the clock on a doomed client, his briefcase already packed, his eyes fixed firmly on the judge's empty chair. Across the aisle, Amelia Sterling sat in the exact same chair, wearing a different but equally modest navy blue cardigan. Josephine Caldwell sat next to her, arranging a remarkably thin stack of papers. The 60-page legal briefs of the previous week were gone, replaced by a simple, brutal finality. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Thomas Mercer took the bench, his expression severe. He adjusted his blouses, skipping the usual pleasantries, and looked directly at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Hughes, we are here to finalize the dissolution of marriage and the division of the remaining marital assets," Judge Mercer stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "I trust your client has had time to review the final settlement drafted by the defense." Gregory stood, buttoning his jacket with none of his usual flair. "We have, Your Honor," and while we vehemently object to the circumstances, my client is prepared to sign the uncontested dissolution. Nah. Before we proceed to signatures, Josephine Caldwell interrupted smoothly, standing up, there is one final financial disclosure that must be placed on the record to ensure a clean severing of the marital estate. It concerns Mr. Sterling's personal liabilities. Richard didn't even look up. He just stared blankly at the wood grain of the table. Over the past 5 days, he had been locked out of his corporate accounts, ignored by his board, and blocked by David. Madison Hayes, upon realizing Richard was no longer a billionaire CEO but an unemployed man facing fraud charges, had promptly packed her bags, taken the Cartier bracelet, and blocked his number. He was completely alone. "Proceed, Miss Caldwell," Judge Mercer allowed. During the forensic audit of Mr. Sterling's personal finances, which was completed this past Friday, Josephine began, walking toward the center of the room, we discovered a rather significant encumbrance. 18 months ago, Mr. Sterling took out a personal line of credit with Silicon Valley Bank for $15 million. He used this money to purchase a penthouse in Soho, a fleet of luxury vehicles, and to fund his rather extravagant extracurricular lifestyle. Gregory looked at Richard, his eyes widening. "Richard, you told me those were company leases." Richard merely slumped further in his chair, remaining silent. "They were personal lines of credit," Josephine corrected. "And what did Mr. Sterling use as collateral to secure a $15 million personal loan?" "He used his 49% equity stake in Sterling Innovations." Judge Mercer leaned forward, anticipating the drop, "a stake that he no longer possesses." "Exactly, Your Honor," Josephine smiled thinly. "Because this court legally seized that equity to cover the damages of his corporate embezzlement, the collateral has evaporated. On Monday morning, Silicon Valley Bank triggered an automatic default clause. They have accelerated the loan. Mr. Sterling personally owes the bank $15 million due immediately. He is, by all legal definitions, massively insolvent." A heavy silence descended upon the room. Richard was no longer just stripped of his wealth. He was buried in an insurmountable mountain of debt. He would spend the rest of his life having his wages garnished just to pay the interest. However, Josephine continued, her voice softening slightly as she turned back to her client. "Mrs. Sterling has no desire to see her former husband spend the next 20 years living in poverty, nor does she wish for him to face the impending federal indictments for bank fraud that would inevitably follow this default." Josephine retrieved a single crisp document from her folder and laid it on the railing in front of Richard. "Aegis Holdings has reached an agreement with the bank. My client has purchased your debt in full, Mr. Bat Sterling. The $15 million is paid. In exchange, you will sign this document. It is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a formal relinquishment of any historical claim to Sterling Innovation. You will not give interviews, you will not write a memoir, and you will never publicly claim to be the sole founder of the company. You will simply fade away." Richard stared at the paper. It was a lifeline woven from sheer humiliation. She was saving him, again, but this time she was erasing him from the history books. "If you sign," Josephine concluded, "you walk out of here today with no debt, a clean slate, and a severance stipend of $200,000 to start a new life. If you do not sign, we let the bank tear you to pieces. The choice is yours." Richard's hands shook as he picked up the pen Gregory silently slid across the table. He didn't read the document. He didn't look at his lawyer. For the first time in the entire proceeding, he lifted his head and looked directly into Amelia's eyes. He searched them for a glimmer of vindictive triumph, a smirk, a sign that she was enjoying his destruction. He found nothing but calm, professional indifference. The ultimate insult. To Amelia Montgomery Sterling, this wasn't revenge. It was just a corporate restructuring. Richard pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name, officially signing away his company, his legacy, and his illusion of control. He stood up, avoiding the eyes of the judge, the gallery, and his ex-wife, and walked out the heavy mahogany doors, his footsteps echoing faintly down the long, empty marble hallway. And that is how you dismantle an arrogant tech billionaire without ever raising your voice. Amelia proved that true power doesn't need to boast, brag, or wear expensive suits. It just needs to own 51% of the voting shares. If you enjoyed watching Richard's massive ego get legally shredded and loved every single twist in this courtroom saga, please smash that like button right now. Share this incredible story of karma with your friends, because we all know someone who needs a reminder to appreciate the people who support them behind the scenes. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the craziest real-life legal battles. Tell me down in the comments, do you think Amelia was too generous paying off his debt, or did Richard get exactly what he deserved? See you in the next video.